This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise them telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and you're watching Palestine Declassified. We're the only weekly TV show focusing on investigating and exposing the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. In this week's show, we'll be looking at the relentless and unflinching determination of the Palestinian people to throw off the shackles of Zionist oppression, the sadistic brutality of Zionist military goons, and the savage behaviour of illegal settlers have completely failed to blunt the will of the Palestinian people to resist. Latifa Abou-Chakra has been looking back at the First Intifada, when the Palestinian people rose up against Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
The First Intifada, or uprising, began in December 1987, 36 years ago. It ended in September 1993 with the signing of the first Oslo Accords, which provided a framework for so-called peace negotiations with the Palestinians. The failure of that process is visible for all to see today. In the First Intifada, Israeli brutality was abundantly demonstrated. Palestinians were casualties at the ratio of more than 3-1. One new departure were the orders from the top to break the bones of protesters. The tactic was exposed in famous footage broadcast on mainstream news networks the world over. Israeli Colonel Yehuda Meir was tried for his part in these crimes. He blamed then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who gave orders in January 1988 to break bones of protesters as punishment. Rabin claimed it was only to bring them under control. Either way, Rabin's orders had gone out via the Israeli press, where he was quoted saying, "We will break their bones." Meir admitted ordering beatings, but then said, "I feel like they abandoned me and threw me to the dogs." He reportedly began to cry minutes later and asked for a recess. Though eventually found guilty of brutality, the highest-ranking IOF soldier convicted on that charge, he avoided prison and was only stripped of his rank and discharged as a private. A second departure was the use of undercover death squads in Gaza and the West Bank, codenamed Shimshon and Davdevan, officially known as Unit 367 and Unit 217. Operating in Arab dress in the period until 1992, they executed more than 100 Palestinians. Unit 367 was later disbanded, but Unit 217 remains active in the West Bank. The start of the Intifada is dated to 9th of December 1987. Just like October 7th this year, the conflict did not begin then. The proximate causes were intensified ethnic cleansing, land expropriation, and settlement construction. Increasing Zionist repression, the emergence of a new layer of Palestinian activists who challenged the leadership of the PLO. We should not forget the striking reconfiguring of October the 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation, in the night of the gliders in which 2 Palestinian guerrillas used hang gliders to infiltrate the northern border and kill 6 occupation force operatives on 25th of November 1987. The guerrillas were immortalized in many Palestinian posters and images produced in commemoration. The hang gliding attackers hailed from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is one of the key guerrilla groups engaged in the Al-Aqsa flood in Gaza. A key difference between then and now is today's unity of the fields, in which all the major factions collaborate closely in armed actions against the occupation.
As always, we're joined by our resident expert, David Miller. David's an academic and a former professor at Bristol University, and he's now a non-resident senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zeyim University. He's also a co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch, and he's a leading British scholarly critic of Israel. Our guest today is the Palestinian doctor, activist, academic and writer, Dr. Ghada Karmi. Ghada was born in Jerusalem and forced from her home during the Nakba. She later trained as a medical doctor and established the first British Palestinian medical charity in 1972. She was also an Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and her books include the best-selling memoir, In Search of Fatima. Welcome to the show. Ghada, let me start with you. I mean, you were forced out of Palestine in 1948, weren't you? And then witnessed the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank from afar in 1967. I wonder whether you could just recall how you felt at the time of the First Intifada.
Well, I had already become an activist following the 1967 war, because it was the first time I remember that I began to understand what Israel was about.
Yeah.
And it was very clear to me from that day on that what they were about was occupying the rest of Palestine, and that's what they wanted. The First Intifada was so hopeful. It was a wonderful moment for all of us who had felt a kind of sense of despair as, you know, living through the 70s in Britain.
Yeah.
Israel's becoming more and more accepted, and it was becoming more and more, quote, normalized.
Indeed.
And, you know, so we started to feel a bit hopeless that,
Yeah.
you know, and then comes the First Intifada, and you think, well, of course, we didn't know it was first then.
No,
Comes an Intifada in which reasserts the fact that there's a Palestinian people and they are not willing to accept what has been scripted for them by Israel and its Western backers. And by the way, in any discussion we have always to remember that Israel would not be Israel if it were not for Western support.
No, absolutely. Well, David, I mean, you've been involved in pro-Palestinian activism, haven't you, for quite some time now. I think you first got involved, didn't you, in the question of Palestine during that First Intifada in 1987. And I think that was after seeing those brutal beatings, wasn't it, of those Palestinian protesters?
Yes, I mean, one of the first things I ever did in, I suppose, pro-Palestine activism, I didn't really think of it as that then, was when we saw the breaking of the bones, the famous footage of that. And then the BBC reported one of the soldiers who'd been arrested for the breaking of the bones being shown home, released from custody to his kibbutz. And he was welcomed as a gentle giant who was returning to the bosom of his family. Yeah. And we were just outraged at this at the time. I was working at the Glasgow University Media Group. I was a young, not even a PhD student by that stage. And we went into something in Glasgow called the Video Box, which was, where there were several of them around the country, where Channel 4's Right to Reply programme, one of the key benefits of the creation of Channel 4 in terms of democratising the media, where you could go in and you could make a 30-second clip to complain about something. So we went in, I think 3 or 4 of us crammed into this box and we did this thing. It's an outrage that the BBC should refer to these horrific torturers as being gentle giants, and the BBC should have proper coverage of this. And so that was one of my first bits of education about the way in which propaganda operates in relation to Zionism, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's moved on a pace since then, of course. But Ghada, I mean, how has the Zionist regime's oppressive techniques changed since the 1980s, when they officially sanctioned the kind of bone-breaking punishment beatings and these undercover assassinations?
Well, they've got worse. They don't bother to break people's bones; they shoot them dead. No, so that has become. It is amazing that the idea and the spectacle of soldiers just shooting Palestinians, killing them outright, has become so part of the normal landscape. And that's what's so very frightening about all this, is that Zionist violence, which was there right from the start, and you mentioned that I was a victim of the Nakba in 1948. The point about that Nakba, and the same point today, is the violence, is the violence that accompanies Zionism. And so that violence meant that moving on from breaking bones, just simply shoot the people dead. No,
indeed, indeed. It's much more visible now, I think, though, isn't it, than it has ever been in the past with the advent of social media. So more people are aware of the what the Zionism, the reality of Zionism is. But David, I mean, the First Intifada concluded, didn't it, with the Oslo Accords, and of course, many people at the time, I think, thought this was the beginning of a viable peace process, didn't they? But as it turned out, that was just wishful thinking, wasn't it?
Yes, if you recall, in that period, we had the Irish peace process, we had the South African peace process, we had Nelson Mandela released from prison. It looked like this was part of a general tendency in the world to move towards resolving political conflicts. Of course, that was a mistake. We see now that nothing of the sort was happening. And in fact, of course, what happened was that the PLO had recognised the Zionist entity and had also renounced effectively armed resistance against the Zionist entity. And that, of course, led to the marginalising of the PLO. It gave them the Palestinian Authority, of course, the Comprador Authority as it is, and which collaborates directly with the Zionists to repress the Palestinian resistance movement. But it meant that the power in the resistance shifted away from the PLO, especially from Fatah, the leading faction in the PLO, and towards more openly Islamically oriented movements, especially, of course, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But also let's remember the secularist and leftist factions like the DFLP and the PFLP, which are of course all of these factions are now at the centre of the resistance in Gaza.
Yeah, indeed. But God, I mean, in your opinion, what was the problem with the Oslo process?
Well, there was nothing right with it, actually.
Right.
It was full of problems. The first issue is that the Palestinian side offered a recognition of Israel within the borders of the borders, which meant that it kept 78% of the original land of Palestine, recognized their right to that, while actually getting very little in return. Because what they actually got was a recognition on the part of Israel of the Palestine Liberation Organization as the movement that represents the Palestinians. Okay, good, but that's not good enough. There was nothing, people really need to remember, there was nothing in the Oslo Agreement which made it mandatory that the Israel would move towards assisting in the creation of a Palestinian state. That was never overtly stated. It was something that the Palestinians sort of assumed, and lots of other people assumed, but they had no right to assume it because it wasn't in the Accords. And secondly, what it really did was to sort of give a structure to the idea of autonomy, of Palestinian autonomy in certain spheres, which was around for ages. The Egypt-Israel Treaty 1979 already was something which the Israeli side was willing to agree to, and so-called autonomy. Well, that's what Oslo did. It allowed for autonomy, but for things like health, education, civil society type things, but not for defense and not for freedom of movement. So all it really did was give, I think the best way to put it is, it presented a sort of a feel-good thing to other people.
Well, we'll just leave it there if we can for a moment, because I want to come back to the discussion in a while after you've had a chance to look at our next video about the genesis of Hamas.
The term Hamas is an acronym, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which translates into English simply as Islamic Resistance Movement. Resistance is, in other words, literally part of its name. Hamas was effectively born as a direct result of the spark that lit the flame of the First Intifada. The people who created it met the day after the occupation forces killed 4 Palestinian workers by crashing into their car at the Gaza checkpoint. A leaflet issued on December the 14th calling for resistance is considered their first public intervention, though the name Hamas itself was not used until early 1988. Like its key ally in the Palestinian resistance, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, usually called Palestinian Islamic Jihad or PIJ in the West, Hamas was formed from the Muslim Brotherhood. Though the Brotherhood was politically quietist at the time, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad became more radical, seeking to challenge the dominance of Fatah, the secular nationalist group then hegemonic amongst the Palestinians. This task became all the more central once Fatah accepted the existence of the State of Israel and renounced armed struggle. Looking back, it is clear that the First Intifada was a fork in the road between those who believed compromise could lead to progress and those who maintained only resistance could win. Hamas was formed 1 month after a PLO-led declaration advocating coexistence with the Zionist entity in early 1988. After Oslo and then the Gaza withdrawal in 2005, Hamas entered and won the elections in Gaza and became the de facto government. The armed wing of Hamas, the Izz al-Din al-Qassam Brigade, has been branded as a terrorist organization for more than 20 years. In late 2021, the UK moved to ban Hamas in total, including its political wing. Since the launch of Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7, there has been a propaganda war over the role of Hamas in the resistance, in the idea that Hamas was created or supported by the Zionists. This misunderstands the history by confusing the support given by the Zionists to the politically quietist Muslim Brotherhood in order to undermine the more radical PLO, with the more militant politics associated with Hamas. Later, when Ariel Sharon attempted to liquidate the PLO, Hamas did benefit, but its victory in the 2006 election marked the realization of the Zionists that it had become their main enemy. Since then, there were marked periods when the various factions of the resistance were at odds with each other. But in the most recent years, all the resistance factions have made peace and work as one.
David, just say a word or two, will you, about the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine?
So the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is a transnational movement, if you like, with independent parts in different countries. There's one in the UK. And of course, it's been very much targeted in this country. For example, there was an investigation under the Cameron government, which was prompted by Zionist interests lobbying for that investigation to try and to suggest that the Muslim Brotherhood were terrorists. Now, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a terrorist organisation, and in this country it's politically active, has been politically active in the anti-war movement, very important to the anti-war movement actually in this country. But in Palestine, there are two separate factions of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood in the West Bank and Gaza. And they were at the time quite politically quietist. And so that what you found was that the PLO, as a kind of a radical nationalist organisation, was by far the most radical threat to the Zionist entity because they were engaged in armed struggle, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood were not. It was a split from the Muslim Brotherhood which led both to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which of course is the more radical, although smaller of the movements today, and of course Hamas. And once they became the radical cutting edge of resistance, that's when the idea of using them to undermine the PLO became something which the Zionists didn't want to do. And of course that's the story, right? Hamas was not created by Israel. The idea that somehow it's a cat's paw for Western interests is a fantasy, and people in the pro-Palestine movement should abandon any such beliefs and understand that the resistance in Palestine is a serious resistance against not just the Zionist entity, but against Western interests and imperialism in the whole region.
Yeah. Well, God, I wonder whether you might just say something about the evolution of your thinking on resistance.
Well, look, it was always very clear to me from the very beginning, I suppose from the very beginning of my activism or my awareness that we'd have to fight to get our country back. It was always very clear to me that whatever name you wanted to give it, the end result had to be the reclamation of Palestine and all of it for the Palestinians. And that those Palestinians like myself, the millions living in UN registered refugee camps, all those people had the right to go back and reclaim their homeland. It was always very clear to me that that was the aim. So the next question was, how do we get there? And I was really willing to support anything almost anything that would looked as if it might get us there.
Yeah.
That included different kinds. I never had a sort of a fear, and I think many Palestinians are like me, didn't sort of think, oh, we can only support this if it's religiously motivated, or if it's this kind of thing, or that kind of. Not really. I think it's much simpler than that for Palestinians. They just want to get the country back, and they'll back whatever it is that looks likely to get us there.
Yeah.
Now, having, of course, said that, I can't disguise the fact that I was never keen on religious type resistance movements because I always felt that they missed the point.
Right.
The point about Palestine is not religion, it's theft of land. It's very simple.
Sure.
So really you have to get hold of the thief and sort the thief out and get the land back.
Indeed.
So you don't need religion as a motivating factor.
Right.
However, I have to say that over time and observing the way that not only Hamas but Hezbollah in Lebanon has fought their resistance wars so not only bravely but so cleverly is very impressive.
No,
and in the end I ended up by saying, not only me but many others like me, by saying, well, if it takes religion to get you to function like this, then so be it.
Indeed, indeed. David, I think one of the important takeaways from the video that we've just watched is that it contradicts, doesn't it, those who claim that Hamas was created by the Zionists.
It does. I mean, I think this is a mistake that you saw in the film there, a clip from the Intercept making that kind of argument, but there have been many other kinds of arguments like that, and you see, I've seen lots of people tweeting little cuttings from Haaretz with Netanyahu talking about supporting Hamas. It's a mistake and it's a misunderstanding, and of course what we really see is the attempt on parts of the left, I think, to misunderstand the resistance in Palestine and to think because of the horror that we currently are seeing, because of the dead children, the bombing of the buildings, the razing of Gaza, people think that means that the Palestinians can do nothing, and that their only choice is to stay in their homes and die, or to leave into the Sinai, which of course is the Zionist strategy.
Indeed.
But actually, what we see if we pay close enough attention is that there has been really very significant resistance in Gaza, and indeed, of course, in the West Bank, and of course also on the northern border from Hezbollah, very, very serious resistance, which has had really significant effects on the occupation forces. And we're not seeing much of the reporting of that in the Western media, but if you're paying attention to social media, to Telegram, you see a lot of that kind of stuff. And it's a mistake is to think that isn't happening and that isn't a significant actor in this whole period, when of course it is a very, very significant actor. We would never have had the changes for the Palestinian hostages in Israeli jails if it wasn't for that.
Of course, of course. I mean, God, I mean, what do you say to those who insist that we must condemn Hamas? I mean, Piers Morgan is a classic case in point. Every guest he ever has on when talking about this issue, we first ask them, will you condemn Hamas? What should the response be to characters like that?
First, it's good that you bring this up because it's really infuriating. You know, there you are being asked a very important question, and before you're allowed to answer, you have first to make this declaration: I condemn Hamas. Well, no. Really, the proper answer to that is this is not a question of condemnation. It's a question of trying to understand why people behave like this, what makes them do that. That's what really, that it has to face this issue of this word condemn, you know. And the other way to deal with it, which is not original to me, but it's perfectly correct, is to ask the person asking one this question, when did you last condemn an Israeli spokesperson or representative for the actions of the Israeli army?
There's a good response I saw on social media where somebody was asked about, in a demonstration, what about October the 7th? He said, well, what about October the 8th? What about October the 9th? What about October the 11th? They tried to walk away, so I haven't finished answering the question yet. And he kept going on, and he went through all the dates. And then he was sort of saying, and what about, every day back to 1948? So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We do need to push back against that. But look, I'm afraid to say we are out of time. So that's it for another show. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Ghada Karmi, and of course our resident expert, Professor David Miller. Palestine Declassified will be back next week with more forensic investigations and analysis. And in the meantime, you can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. And remember to share today's programme on your social media platforms. So, until next time, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.